One of the most striking things about the Republican primary was how much Donald Trump's legal troubles seemed to help him. But as we head toward the general election, it's important to remember that independents and the larger electorate are kind of a whole different ballgame. Donald Trump will soon be the first president to stand trial on criminal charges coming up in the middle of April. And a new poll shows that more than a third of independent voters say a guilty verdict in the hush money trial would make them less likely to vote for him. And 75% of independents say that presidents shouldn't be immune from criminal prosecution. So could his legal troubles finally catch up to him, at least among independents? And in a close election, just how big a difference could that make? Joining me now, the editor-in-chief and publisher of the Cook Political Report, Amy Walter. Well, first let me say that the fact that you're making all the archives available makes like a political nerd like me thrilled.
Any nerd, even if you're not a big nerd, to go back 40 years and look at some of these contests that we're talking about some of these same people today.
Yes.
But in many cases, you can see just the way in which our politics has changed so dramatically over the last 40 years in like actual print.
And the parties. So
yes, and the parties.
Let me ask you about kind of the poll I just outlined. I mean, polling is tricky. It's as we know, it's a bet on things. It kind of does surprise me, maybe I shouldn't be surprised that if he's convicted, it makes such a difference. I mean, people know the facts and details of these. But what do you make of that and sort of the impact of Trump's legal troubles on, say, independents?
I just think it's really hard, like you said, it's a hypothetical right now. And Mark Blumenthal, who's a Democratic pollster for years and then ran an independent polling group, wrote something the other day that I thought was really smart. You know, back in the time of the impeachment of Bill Clinton in 1998, voters were asked a hypothetical during that, saying, if he's impeached, should he resign? And you had a lot of voters saying, absolutely, he should resign. If the president is impeached, he can't serve any longer. It made a lot of sense until we went through the whole impeachment process. We obviously know what happened in that election. And by the time the impeachment process ended, those same voters were saying, well, no, he shouldn't resign. So I don't know that you can get voters at this moment to say how they will react to whatever is going to come up. And remember, it's not just Trump's legal troubles. Remember, we're going to have the Supreme Court make a lot of decisions about a lot of other issues. The Alabama Supreme Court now is a major issue in this election and their decision on IVF.
Yeah, the court system.
The courts are playing a big part. Yeah.
So I want to ask you, you wrote this recent piece. I read it a couple times because it was so interesting, had a lot of data in it. You love data. I love data. Titled, Biden Hasn't Converted Anti-Trump Voters to Pro-Biden Voters. And the piece is basically about how the Biden team has not converted these people to become like they're excited about Joe Biden. A lot of them are still anti-Trump. And you said if Trump is not at the center of the conversation, Biden's base isn't all that interested in listening to it. And it is one big reason why efforts to sell Biden accomplishments on the economy, jobs, and infrastructure haven't broken through. To succeed, Biden needs this election to be all about Trump. He's got a lot of accomplishments. There are lots of things he can talk about. He can sell them. But it's all about winning. So are you basically saying...
I mean, you know, every campaign, you can't just be about the other person. You have to sell yourself as well. But when you look at the coalition that is the Biden coalition, it's really an anti-Trump coalition. And the numbers that I stated, I thought were really interesting. NBC polling from the going into the 2016 campaign and into that election. Remember, most people who voted for Donald Trump in 2016 weren't pro-Trump. They were anti-Hillary Clinton, right? So he only had about 39% of voters saying, I'm showing up for him. But by the time we got to 2020, 72% of his voters were voting for him, and very few were voting against Biden. Biden came into 2020, about a third saying, I'm voting for Biden, the rest, I'm voting against Trump. That's the same number he's getting in the NBC poll now. That just a third voting for him, essentially, and about 2/3 saying, I'm voting for him because I don't like Trump. So if that's your coalition is motivated by one thing, or mostly one thing, and that is Donald Trump. And the less that Donald Trump's in the picture, the harder it is for Biden to make his case. You see, any time that Trump comes into the news or something around a Trump issue is front and center, you get much more interest and engagement from the voters who turned out and voted for Biden in the last election.
And there's lots of things people are mad about. It's not one thing, right?
It's not one, yes.
The interesting thing about it. The other thing I read today, again, more data, is that Because a lot of people looked at the fact that Trump was overestimated in polls in a lot of the primaries, and he didn't perform as well in most of them. I mean, 10, 15 points in a number of them. There's a political piece today about how that's not a predictor of the general. And we're for real talk here. There's lots of things to be debated. But I wanted to ask you about that, what you thought, and is that true? Do you agree with that assessment?
No, I absolutely do. The number I always look at with Donald Trump is not the gap between what the vote he's getting and what vote, say, Biden or any of his other opponents are getting. That's what you said about, 18 points, 20 points. Look at the vote share. What percent of the vote is he getting in the polls, and what percent of the vote does he end up getting on Election Day? And they really weren't that far off. It basically tells you what's his floor, or actually more, what's his ceiling. And so I think what we learned from the primaries, and we'll be digging more into this. I know the Washington Post also looked into some of these voters who showed up in Georgia and voted for Nikki Haley. Many of them had voted in the Democratic primary in 2020. So it's not to say that there aren't Nikki Haley voters that may be Trump voters from 2020, but there aren't as many as it looks based on those primary results.
When you want to win elections, you got to be clear about the data.
Right.
Amy Walter, thank you so much. I can't wait to go through every House race with you. That's my dream. It's going to happen one day. I've got